Henry Bibb was an American author, abolitionist, and former slave. Born in May of 1815, he was the oldest of 7 brothers born to an African mother in Shelby County, Kentucky. Henry's father was a white man from Kentucky by the name of James Bibb. Little more is known about his father other than his name. Henry spent his early life under the authority of Mr. White. Mr. White was an older widowed gentleman with a daughter about Henry's age. They had been playmates until the daughter was sent off to receive a formal education. During her schooling years, Henry was hired out to pay for her education. One of the men he was forced to work under was a man by the name of Mr. Vyers. The conditions he was forced to endure were terrible and cruel, many of them brought on by the hand of Mrs. Vyers. I was a wretched slave, compelled to work under the lash without wages and often without clothes enough to hide my nakedness. I have often worked without half enough to eat, both late and early, by day and by night. I have often laid my weary limbs down at night to rest upon a dirt floor or bench without any covering at all, because I had nowhere else to rest my weary body after having worked hard all day. Henry Bibb. The first time after Henry ran away, he was determined to live as a free man. A cycle of escape and recapture continued to unfold. Each time Henry was punished, he became more determined. In the year of 1833, Henry met his future wife for the first time. After a short courtship, they married under common law, for at this point it was illegal for one slave to marry another. Soon after they married, his wife Melinda was expecting their first child, a baby girl named Frances. The rough, cruel treatment by his masters was finally enough. For on the same plantation, I was compelled to stand and see my wife shamefully scourged and abused by her master. And the moment in which this was done was so violent and inhumanely committed upon the person of a female that I despair in finding decent language to describe the bloody act of cruelty. Henry Bibb. Henry had had enough, and he was determined to find freedom for his family. This marks the first time he set out for the free lands of Canada. Little did he know he would be making many more trips back to his home of Kentucky to try and free his family. Despite his many attempts, he was never able to free them. Henry was disgusted and appalled by the treatment of his fellow African slaves. Henry was determined to make a difference in the lives of his people. For this very reason, he created Canada's first black newspaper titled Voice of the Fugitive. The newspaper published work that focused on convincing African slaves to settle in Canada. He was also the founding director of a Canadian black colonization project, the Refugee Home Society, for which much of the ads were placed in his newspaper. The narrative of the life of Henry Bibb is a very convincing and thorough piece of work. Written firsthand by Henry Bibb himself, it correctly and accurately portrays his life through his time as a slave. His writing was cross-examined by a committee on April 22, 1845, and proved to be credible. I have heard his story, and must say that I have not the least reason to suspect it being otherwise than true. J.W. Smith. Henry Bibb's narrative only further showed me the gross propaganda and misinterpretations on American slavery. Much of our history classes and novels depict African slaves as weak, simple, and compliant people. Our media and history tells us stories of compliance and stupidity. While it is quite clear, based on the accounts of countless African slaves, including Henry, that this is very much the opposite. The African slaves forced into the tireless, back-breaking work were strong. They were determined. They were courageous. They were and are a people who refuse to take a lash without fighting back. They overcame their hardships and have grown into a culture who are not afraid to embrace their beautiful and diverse backgrounds. Henry Bibb showed me what true love means to a family. Henry was given 2 options in his life. He would either comply to the will of his white masters, he would take the cruel, brutal punishments while working their lands, or he would escape and try to better the future of his family and even perhaps his people. He was born into slavery, but he was determined to die a free man. Free from the chains of his oppressors and free from the mental strain he was accustomed to. Henry set out on a dark and dusty road to an unfamiliar place. But he was determined. He was determined to escape and find a new life for his family. If there is one thing we remember about the African slaves, it's that they are not the weak people our history books tell us to believe.